This learning module is about history and historical sources in Japan. What I'd like to do in this lesson are two things. First, I'd like to focus on primary sources in Japanese history. What they are, where to find them, if they've been translated, how authoritative they are, what genres do they fall into besides history. Second, I'd like to focus on how Japanese historians organize secondary materials and what resources there are, what secondary resources and primary resources there are available to us today. So let me start with primary sources. And Webb calls these dynastic histories, but I'm going to really call them imperial histories. To me, dynasty seems an inappropriate term given what we covered earlier about Japanese history and reign titles and that kind of thing. The first and most prominent work is the Kojiki, and I think I've mentioned this already before. This was written in 712 and composed of mostly Manyogana. It's extremely difficult to read as a text. It recounts Japanese history from the age of the gods to the late 7th century. Now, ostensibly, what the Kojiki and subsequent works are is a Japanese response to what the Chinese were doing with their history. So in Chinese history, there are official dynastic histories that add each layer, if you will, upon layer throughout Chinese history. And what those largely do is cover the politics of the time, who had what government position, if there were a battle, who was fighting whom, who was the victor, that kind of information. And largely, the Chinese and the Japanese imperial or dynastic histories, their purpose is to shore up the legitimacy of the emperor. So the Kojiki does this. It recounts Japanese history from the age of the gods, which is, way back, prehistory, and goes all the way up to the late 7th century. So a lot of the Kojiki is actually genealogy. First, I want to show you what the text itself looks like in the original, and then we'll take a look at the translation. This is the opening passage here. And you'll see that on the right, in this section, we have a still difficult to read but manageable text that has a mixture of kanji and kana, somewhat what we might expect. And then on the left here, we see how it appeared originally. And you can see this is much more difficult. This is sort of an odd mixture of classical Chinese and Manyogana. This is really difficult text to read. And indeed, one of the reasons that the Kojiki kind of disappeared from the scene for centuries after it was produced was because it was kind of difficult to read. And then in the Tokugawa period, it experienced a kind of revival because of Kokugaku, because of national learning and a focus on the origins of the country. Okay, I know that screen's really scary, so let's move to what the English translation is. Here you can see what I mean by a genealogy. So we're told at the time of the beginning of heaven and earth, there came into existence these various deities, and these deities all came into existence as single deities, and their forms were not visible. So this is really, it's like reading Genesis, basically. And so a good part of the Kojiki is this recounting of the genealogy from the gods down to, as you might expect, the imperial family at the time. And that legitimized the imperial family's rule. So the Kojiki was one of the first works, but it certainly wasn't the only work. There's a collection called the Rikkokushi of works, of historical works, that are imperially commissioned histories. What that means is that the emperor or the empress commissioned a historian or a team of historians to write these histories. And they are the closest thing, really, that Japan has to China's dynastic histories. As we'll see, when we move forward in Japanese history, the government gets away from depending on those sorts of dynastic histories and focusing more on informal or personal histories. The Japanese imperial histories, they exist, but they have much less importance than the Chinese dynastic histories. And this is largely due to the decline after the Heian period of the power of the imperial family. So the scholars compiling the histories were just as ineffectual and uninfluential as those commissioning the histories in the first place. They're kind of still going through the motions, producing these histories because that's what a legitimate ruler is supposed to do. At least that was what the case was in the Chinese context. But of course, once we get out of the Heian period, the imperial family's power is severely diminished, and really the power that is in control of the country is military. Probably the most well-known of these 6 histories, the Rikkokushi, is the Nihon Shoki. That was published in 720. I hate to say word published. That was produced in 720, and it actually covers much of the same ground that the Kojiki does. And the Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki, usually mentioned in the same breath, have been both translated into English. They're not necessarily fun reading. It took a long time for these translations to come out, and I'm not surprised that they were not bestsellers. But I mention this because as a student of Japanese studies, if you want to access the primary texts, then it's important to know what you can really wrap your brain around, what you can grab, what you can digest. These 2 works are also the only 2 histories to be included in the Nihon Koten Bungaku Taikei. So apropos of that, I want to mention where to find these things. These works are available in the Nihon Koten Bungaku Taikei. The subsequent histories I'm going to describe for the next few centuries don't appear. But if you wanted to find them, you can often find them in digital collections, and I'll be addressing that later on this semester. But it's kind of interesting that the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki are then included in the Nihon Koten Bungaku Taikei, because Nihon Koten Bungaku means classical Japanese literature, the collection of classical Japanese literature. And so that word literature is kind of being used loosely here. You'll recall when I was discussing literary resources that the genres tend to be drawn with different lines in the Japanese tradition than what we see in the Western tradition. And these histories demonstrate that. So the Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki ostensibly are histories, but of course they include an awful lot of mythology, and consequently scholars have blurred that line between a history and literature. So besides those 2 works, besides the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, what about the rest of the Rikkokushi? Here they are, and they're also listed in web, as you'll see. The Shoku Nihongi, the Nihon Koki, the Shoku Nihon Koki, the Nihon Montokuten no Jitsuroku, the Nihon Sandai Jitsuroku, and, that was the total, because we got 6, and the first one is the Nihon Shoki. These go subsequently by chunks of time, as you see, 697 to 791. 792 to 833, 833 to 850, 850 to 858, and 858 to 887. So they usually cover one or more reigns of an emperor or an empress. And you also might not be surprised to see that this material, as Miller notes, is available for later reigns, so the successive volumes devote greater length to shorter periods of time. We have a lot more material on that period between 697 and 887 than we do in the Kojiki, for example, which is time immemorial until 712. This is the list from web, and you might want, if you've got your web handy, you might want to pull that out and take a look at the histories as they are listed. There's more information here than what I'm necessarily going to have on the slides. There's some description here. So the first 7 historical works that Webb lists as canonical are the Kojiki and the 6 national histories. This is certainly not an exhaustive list, but it is representative of what historians think of as a historical canon. You can certainly find other works on other canonical lists, but I think as an undergraduate, if you're familiar with these titles, that's about all you're probably going to need. One of the other nice things that Webb does in his list is provide bibliographic information to some of the translations of these works. Now, of course, Webb was published in the early 1960s, so I'm going to be adding today an update. If there is a more recent translation, I'll let you know what that is. But if you are curious about these particular works, then what you can do is follow up on each one of these listings. And now that you know how to use WebCat and JSTOR and Project Muse and the Bibliography for Asian Studies Online, I would expect you to have no difficulty tracking down each one of these citations. Now, I said earlier that the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki were the only 2 that had been fully translated. Do note that the Shoku Nihongi, Shoku here means continuation, the Shoku Nihongi has been partially translated into English. In a lot of cases, partial is about all you can get your hands on. These are pretty old translations. Note that they date to the 1930s. I hate to say it, but often those works from the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, can be problematic depending on who the translator was about how accurate they are. So if we move past the 6 histories, the next 4 histories in Webb's list are important sources for early Japanese history, and they're supplemental to the Rikkokushi. So it starts with the Sendai Kuju-hongi and then the Kogo Shui. And if we go on to the next page, we see the Ruiju Kokushi and the Nihon Kiryaku. Notice that these are not available in translation. I wouldn't expect you to really get a handle on these, but I want you just to understand what the canon is. Next is a list of 4 more works, the Shinkokushi, the Gekinikki, the Honcho Seiki, and the Fusoryaki. Most of these have been partially or wholly lost. Note, for example, in number 12, Webb lists it, but he tells us it's no longer extant. We know it existed because other works refer to it. I'm sorry, that's not number 12, it's number 13. Other works refer to it, and this one is also no longer extant. And we might, other works may reference it and quote it, but we don't have any full version of it anymore. Notice the Fusoryaki includes quotations from some important primary sources otherwise lost. That's my example. Okay. The next chunk of histories, numbers 16 through 22, are written, they start in the late Kamakura period. These are all listed chronologically. And Webb doesn't give us a whole lot of information about each one except to tell us what the coverage is. These works are also not going to be included, for example, in the Nihon Koten Bungaku Taikei or any other general literary collection. But if they are extant, then one might find them in some of the databases that I'll be discussing later on. All right, let's move on to private histories. So everything that we were just looking at was an official government history in some capacity. At least it was written by an important prominent person in the government. But in Japanese history, what they call private histories are significant and important primary sources. So we can't just ignore them. Just because they weren't imperially commissioned doesn't mean that they don't have an important role to play. These private histories usually tell of one person's experience or one person's take on history, usually in the imperial court. And there's a little bit here of a blurring line between literature and history. These works that we're going to be looking at a little more closely on subsequent slides are typically compiled in literary compendia like the Nihon Koten Bungaku Zenshu or the Nihon Koten Bungaku Taikei. So these are much easier for you to get your hands on, and actually they're also largely translated into English. So we'll start with number 23, the Mizukagami. So we have Mizukagami, O Kagami, Ima Kagami, Mas Kagami, and Eiga Monogatari. You'll notice there's a similarity here, the word Kagami, which means mirror. So the mirrors were seen as reflective of reality. That's why the word Kagami appears in the title. And Eiga Monogatari was sort of an exception to that rule in terms of its title. But let's look at Mizukagami through Masukagami first. These cover the Heian period and bleed into, as we get further on down, the end of the Heian and the beginning of the Kamakura. I've got a whole bunch of updates for you on these particular works. First of all, the O Kagami has been translated as O Kagami, the Great Mirror, Fujiwara Michinaga and His Times by Helen Craig McCullough. And Eiga Monogatari has been translated as A Tale of Flowering Fortunes, Annals of Japanese Aristocratic Life in the Heian Period, again by McCullough and her husband. What are these works? These are works that tell us about everyday life in the imperial court, and they're encyclopedic. Particularly Eiga Monogatari, I have read it cover to cover. I never assign it to students because I think they would become overwhelmed by the minutia. So what do I mean by minutia? What people are wearing, what they are doing at a particular festival or event, how a dance goes, how an incense contest goes, how a poetry contest goes, what sort of correspondence is being sent back and forth. We know a tremendous amount about everyday life in the imperial court thanks to these kinds of works. And so they do veer off a little bit from the political tone of those earlier histories that we were discussing. But they still have an important role of legitimizing certain characters at court. So if someone is described as wearing such and such clothing, so many robes layered in such a way, matching the colors in such a way, that lauds that person or maybe criticizes that person. And so each one of these histories sings the praises of a person or a group of people at the court, therefore legitimizing them. But what happens at the end of the Heian period? Well, there's that nasty war, 1180 to 1185, the Genpei War. And the next section of histories covers that period. They are loosely categorized as Gunki Monogatari, or War Chronicles. This group focuses on that late Heian period, beginning in the 1170s, and then into the early Kamakura period, the time of the Genpei War, and the disturbances prior to the Genpei War and right after the Genpei War. These have monogatari in their title, but they're also considered histories. They are embellished histories. We know that some things we read in these are an exaggeration. We're pretty sure it's an exaggeration. For example, the number of people killed or people who participated in battles, specific battles and things like that, numerically seem a little bit hard to swallow, but they do chronicle for us much of what happened in these battles. So on Webb's list, this begins with number 28, Heike Monogatari, the tale of the Heike. Most of you are probably familiar with this. There are actually quite a number of translations of the tale of the Heike. I didn't even try and annotate them here. It's very easy to find them. If you go to WorldCat and type in Heike Monogatari, you'll see a nice selection. And almost every undergraduate library is going to have at least one copy of that. I did want to mention that Hogen Monogatari has been translated as Hogen Monogatari Tale of the Disorder in Hogen by William R. Wilson. That was translated in the 70s. And then later, um, Hogen Monogatari and Heiji Monogatari, very recently, just last year in 2012, were translated by Royal Tyler as Before Heike and After Hogen, Heiji, and Jokyuki. The Jokyuki does not appear here on Webb's canonical list, but the Hogen Monogatari and the Heiji Monogatari do. And so you can read both of those in their entirety. And the reason that Royal Tyler translated them is he had already translated the Tale of the Heike Monogatari, and he felt like he needed to include the events in Hogen and Heiji because they surround, and Jokyuki, because they surround the Genpei War 1182-1185 as recounted in Heike Monogatari. So that ends the list of war chronicles. So what's next on Webb's list? These sections here, number 32 through 38. The Azuma Kagami, the Taiheiki, the Gukansho, the Jinno Shotoki, the Baishoron, the Horyaku Kanki, and the Kaie Sandaiki. And these all have a very personal flavor to them. So, for example, let's look at the description of the Gukansho. It says that this is the first interpretive history in Japanese from the fact that Jien appended to it an essay on Japanese polity. The body of the work is an analytic account from the foundation of the imperial line to Jien's own time. So one of the other remarkable things about these works is that some of them have clear authors. I didn't mention this when we were looking at the earlier ones, but the earlier ones we don't necessarily have a clear author, and here we begin to have clear individual authors writing these works. A couple updates for you. One is that the Azuma Kagami has been partially translated in Monumenta Nipponica. Of course, that's available on JSTOR, so you can find that relatively easily. The Gukansho was more recently translated than what citation appears here. In the more recent translation, it's called The Future and the Past, a translation and study of the Gukansho, an interpretive history of Japan, written in 1219. That does not appear in a journal, that's a separate volume. So these works between 32 and 38 cover what we usually call the medieval period, from 1180 to the 15th century to about 1425. And that takes us into what's known as the Warring States period, or the Age of Unification. Oh, there's one more update. The text here, the Jinno Shotoki, was translated into English as A Chronicle of Gods and Sovereigns, Jinno Shotoki of Kitabatake Chikafusa. So here we are in the next part of the list, 39 through 45. This covers the Warring States period and the so-called Age of Unification. We have a history of Nobunaga, Oda Nobunaga here, and then another one here. Of course, Nobunaga was the first of the three unifiers. And these works cover that tumultuous period and then lead us into the Tokugawa. So you see, for example, the Honcho Tsugan is written 1644 to 1670. The Tokugawa period sees this development of national learning and a focus again on Japanese history, and the works that we see here, the remainder of Webb's list, are from the Tokugawa and largely by very big names in those area studies, if you will, Yamaga Soko, Arai Hakuseki. The more you study about the Tokugawa period, the more you become familiar with these particular names. And the very last two works that he includes are the Tokugawa Jiki and the Zoku Tokugawa Jiki. So this is a continuation of this. And Tokugawa Jiki means a true account of the Tokugawa. This was commissioned by the Tokugawa government. So it's not imperially commissioned, but it is commissioned by the shogun as a history of the Tokugawa shogunate. To what end? To legitimize it. And consequently, the Zoku Tokugawa Jiki does the same thing, and that's compiled from shogunal archives after 1868, after the Meiji Restoration. So again, if these works are not available in translation, I wouldn't expect you to rush out and try and use them in writing a paper if you're an undergraduate. But it is handy to kind of see the titles of the canon and have a feel for what's considered important, the most important works in history. And also, if they are available in translation, then you know that that's a primary source. It's very important. It's considered something that is respectable or, in some sense, academically significant in the Japanese context. So now, before we move on to secondary sources, I just have sort of two addenda to add to that. First of all, I wanted to show you this page. This is not a page of anything that we were just discussing. This is actually a page of the law code of the Bakufu. Just to give you a feel for what you might find if you were doing more advanced research. The layout of this page looks a lot like what we saw in the Nihon Koten Bungaku Taikei or the Nihon Koten Bungaku Zenshu. Well, it doesn't have a modern translation, but it does have a Japanese version of classical Chinese text, right? So typically law codes would be written in classical Chinese, they're official government documents, and then scholars have annotated that. Here we have footnotes at the top and given us Japanese versions of the particular code. Now there's one section of private histories that I haven't addressed yet, and I'd like to do that here. And that is diaries. Diaries as a genre, which I've mentioned before when we were looking at literature, are very important historical resources. They're certainly subjective, but they are also histories of individual lives and have been treated as such by scholars. They have the advantage of being relatively entertaining reading also. I mean, some of that early stuff is pretty dry reading. Take, for example, that opening passage that we looked at from the Kojiki, the Diary of Murasaki Shikibu, or the Pillow Book, which is really a diary, observations in a diary. There are plenty of other diaries particularly from the Heian period, and it's through those that we have also learned an awful lot about what everyday life was like, at least for people at the imperial court. Sadly, we don't have very much information at all about what was happening outside the imperial court because the peasants are illiterate, they're not recording their lives, and they're considered beneath observation on the part of members of the imperial court. So the imperial court certainly has no interest in recording, let's say, peasant or farmer life. The only thing that was really important was legitimizing the imperial family. So these diaries of particularly the Heian period are also found in the Nihon Koten Bungaku Zenshu and the Taikei and some other classical compendia. And you may see them listed as histories in some other lists outside of Webb's. Okay, let's move on to secondary sources. I don't think I need to run through how to find lots of secondary sources in English because we already did that by looking at JSTOR and Project Muse and the Bibliography for Asian Studies Online and WorldCat, etc., etc. What I'd like to do instead is talk about secondary sources within the realm of Japanese historical research. So, in other words, when we were looking at JSTOR and all those other things, what we're really looking at is secondary sources that are produced by and used by Western scholars for the most part. So now I want to take you into the realm of the Japanese historian and some of how the Japanese historians organize their lives and their research and what kind of resources they use. First, I want to mention the Shiryo Hensanjo, and Webb mentions this too, but as you can probably tell now that Webb is almost, I guess it is, 50 years old, that some of that information needs to be updated. The Shiryo Hensanjo is still based at Tokyo University, so that much of what Webb says is still the case. And that organization has expanded to the web, thank goodness. So what is it? It's the Historiographical Institute. That's the translation of the Shido Henzanjo. And it's a research institution affiliated with the University of Tokyo, and it is devoted to the analysis, compilation, and publication of historical source materials concerning Japan. Since its foundation in 1869, right back at the beginning of the Meiji period, the institution has been a major center of Japanese historical research and makes historical sources available through its library, its publications, and more recently, its databases. It does have a limited, albeit limited, English language interface, so it's not quite as scary to use as you might think. The Dai Nihon Shirio, one of the major publications, the Great Japanese History that Webb mentions, has been converted into a database. But to search it and digest the contents, you have to function pretty fluently in Japanese. So again, this is not something that I would necessarily expect an undergraduate to be able to do. But let me just quickly show you what that page looks like. This is the introductory page, the overview page of the Shirio Henzanjo, and it has a quick description of it. What we'd like to do is look at its databases. And here we have a whole description of it and a sort of a disclaimer. Let's go to the database list. And what we're looking for is the Dai Nihon Shirio Unified Database. You'll recall Webb mentions this as a huge yet to be finished project. Sadly, it is still yet to be finished. I think this is such an ongoing thing. It will never really be claimed to be finished. History never stops moving. At this point in the web page, we have to say goodbye to our English language interface. If we click on Dai Nihon Shirio Unified Database, it will take us to this, which admittedly many students might find really quite scary. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger because I think it's kind of small on the screen there. So there's a basic search engine where you can limit it by particular dates, and you can limit it by what kind of materials you're looking for. Just as an example, I'm going to type in Taira no Kiyomori, the great villain of the Tale of the Heike. And I'm going to search all different kinds of materials. I'll get way too many hits, but we'll do it anyway. And I'm not going to limit it by date or anything like that. I'll get 20 hits per page. Now I'm going to search. So you see, I did get way too many hits, more than anybody could ever digest, 138. But just to give you an example of what each thing is. So it gives you the date, and notice that gives it to you not in the Western calendar, but in the Japanese calendar. So we have the Nengo, the rain title, and then these are lunar dates. If you wanted to know what the Western date is, of course, you could always use Nengo Calc and do the conversion. If you want to see the details, you click here, and it gives you more bibliographic information about the work and connected works. And this is a really cool feature. If you want to see the manuscript, you see this button over on the right? If we click on that, it will give us a picture of the manuscript, a JPEG of the manuscript. Isn't that a wonderful thing? So in the bad old days, you would have to go to Tokyo and spend a lot of time and money finding these materials. But nowadays, so much of it is available online. So if you're interested in history and you're thinking about maybe pursuing Japanese history at the graduate level, this is one of those resources that you will come back to again and again. So now let's talk a little bit about the organization of history in the Japanese context. Japanese historians don't necessarily arrange their materials the same way that Western historians do. And I think it's handy to understand how this organization is structured, because then when you do start delving into Japanese language materials, you'll have a much better feel of what to expect and how to find what you're looking for. Prior to the computer age, possibly, I think the biggest problem for Japanese historians was one of organization. And, okay, to be fair, it's not just Japanese historians. Everybody benefited tremendously by the advent of digitization. There are many ways to organize a text. I think we all know that. You can organize it historical or by something that's historical or something that's referenced. But the best way often depends on what one needs the source for, not some higher principle. And we could apply that statement, for example, to dictionaries also. We certainly saw how the structure of a dictionary can change depending on what the user is going to be using it for. Whether we get the rhyme, whether we get the references to the Chinese classics, whether we get a definition, whether we get a part of speech, all that kind of thing is really dependent on the user. So historians have organized Japanese history in accordance with a number of principles based on what their needs are, and not some high authority that just dictates that's the way it should be. So histories are often organized either by strict chronological order, and that's called a nembetsu. We're going to be looking in greater detail about that in just a minute. Or they could be organized by the people involved in those events, and that's called a jimbetsu. These are all categories, by the way, that Webb also recounts. And the third way is that various events in history, from beginning to end, can be lined up in a jibetsu. And that ji is koto, or thing. So, for example, a jibetsu might tell you all about the Genpei War, but then also tell you about the various natural disasters that occurred in Japan between 1181 and 1187 as two separate narratives. So those two narratives would not overlap in the text. I mean, in time-wise, they overlap, of course, but they're kept separate in the narrative. So if you're doing research in Japanese history, one of the major resources that I would recommend is the Nihon Nekishi Daijiten. Here's an example of a page from it, and I know that's way too small, so let's blow it up a little bit so we could take a look at a closer entry. This is organized according to the Goju Onzu, and it gives us important works in history, important people in history. If it's a person, for example, they will give us the person's birth and death dates. And then, much like the biographical dictionaries that we already looked at, information about that person's life. If it's a work here, it's a war chronicle, then it will describe that and tell us what the content is. This is not too different from what we might expect from a Western historical encyclopedia or dictionary. So that's familiar to us. Let's look at what a nembetsu looks like. A lot of people like to think of nembetsu just as timelines, and really that's how they're often presented. So I'm going to show you some examples of that. These charts are from the Nihon Nekishi Daijiten, that thing we were just looking at. This is available in the SUNY Albany library. Whether your library has it or not, if you're on a different campus, is a little bit up in the air. But there's one volume within that multi-volume dictionary that has a extended and detailed nembetsu timeline. And what I want to do is walk you through chronologically a couple sample pages from this chart from each major time period in Japan, and show you what sorts of events and people get noted, and what's considered important by historians. So early on in Japanese history here, I've chosen very early on, the 6th century. Early in Japanese history, we don't have much information. We really don't know a whole lot about what was going on. This page is from the 6th century, and the imperial rank system hasn't been implemented yet. We already talked about ranks. You'll recall that gets implemented in 645. So all we have here is a listing of the emperor or the empress. We don't have, for example, the prime minister or anything like that. Let's zoom in on it a little bit so you can get a better idea of what's listed here. The year in the Western calendar appears here. So the year 600, 596, 593. And then, see, this is Ningo. That gives us the reign title, and it gives us the cycle of the year. So the year 600 in the Western calendar was this particular cycle. And they don't have the reign title for everything because that hadn't really taken effect yet on this page. We'll see it on the next example. It tells us who the emperor was, or the empress. In this case, it was an empress. And I've given you the romanization for each one of those names. And then it tells us, it lumps all these things together. We got the politics, the economics, society, and culture. Sorry, the arrows are off to the left, but they should be to the right. But it gives you an idea of what the important events are considered in this history. So what does it tell us? This year a debate took place about whether to pray to Buddhist idols. That was a big deal. This year, the authority of Mimana, which was on the Korean peninsula, was overthrown by Shilla, who's also on the Korean peninsula. This year, Soga no Umako, Prince Shotoku et al. Overthrew the Mononobe. That was a huge event. And then we have a little bit more information about Shotoku and other things, including the king of Wa, which is technically Japan, sent an emissary to the Sui court in China. Okay, so let's go forward to a period of Japanese history that's a little more detailed. This page is from the 10th century, and now we have the rank system in place from China, the imperial court rank system. The reign title system is there and cemented. And we get a lot more detail about important events because by the 10th century, historians are recording an awful lot more information. Let's look a little more closely at this chart. And I want to emphasize that understanding how this chart is put together is important. I'm going to test you on this on the final exam, so don't just zone out on this. Okay, so what do we see? The year in the Western calendar is across the top. So these two characters here indicate the Western calendar. Okay. Here's the year 970, for example. Note that this chart is from a Japanese book, and so it reads right to left. I cannot emphasize that enough. I've seen lots of students misinterpret the chart because they are assuming moving left to right. It moves right to left. So if you're going from this column to this one, you're going forward in time. All right, and you'll see why that's important in just a minute. In this row here, they give us the year in the Japanese calendar with the Nengo. Okay, and they give us the cycle with an intercalary 5th month noted right there. So in that year, there was an intercalary 5th month. I'm going to repeat that because a lot of people have a hard time with this chart. Okay, so, and I'm going to change color so you can really follow what I'm doing here. The year 968 was the first year of the Nengo Anna. That's pronounced Anna. It looks like Anwa, but it's Anna. Okay, and that reign title, that Nengo, only lasted 2 years. This year and this year. And then when we get over into this column, we see there's a new Nengo. It's Tenroku. Okay, so this is the first year of Tenroku. This is the first year of Anna here. This is the second year of Anna. And this is the first year of Tenroku. So if I asked you, was there an intercalary month in the second year of Anna, you'd say, yup, there certainly was. There it is right there. Okay. I took some of those blue marks away so you could read the chart a little bit better. Before we go and look at a few more details, I want to point out that this column gives us the emperor, the regent and or the chancellor, the grand minister, the prime minister, the minister of the left, and the minister of the right. So we'll be looking at that in a couple more subsequent slides in greater detail. So those are the important ranks of this period in the 10th century. So here's the chart again, and I want to look just at this little box here. This is in that row that tells us who the emperor is, okay? And if we blow it up down here, you can see it a little more clearly. So on this page here, in this particular box, we see the Deizei emperor. There's the characters, Deizei, okay? And there they are again. The Deizei emperor reigned from the 25th day of the 5th month until the 13th day of the 8th month of Anna 2. So the kanji here that you really need to recognize is this one, which means from, and this one, which means to. Okay? So on this chart, wherever we see those, and we see them all over the place, we have to remember this is from and to. So that emperor takes place, or that takes the throne. He reigns from the 5th month, 25th day of the lunar calendar until the 8th month, 13th day of Anna 2. Okay, let's look at a couple of more details here. Further down in the chart, we see some details about the politics and the economy and society of the time. And I've just chosen a couple interesting tidbits here to highlight. On the 4th month and the 2nd day, the Deizei-in temple or monastery, depends what you want to call it, burned down. On the 7th month, the 14th day, Fujiwara Moroji dies at the age of 58. On the 10th month, 10th day, Fujiwara Arihira dies at the age of 79. And this year in Setsu, Minamoto no Mitsunaka built the Tara Shrine. So these are important political, economic, and social events of that time. If we look at cultural events, we'll see, for example, that on the 8th month and the 22nd day, stomping songs and other art forms are officially revived. Incidentally, my colleague Charles Hartman, who's in Sinology, has written an article about stomping songs. If you want to know what they are, you can go check that out. Stomping refers more to dance style than to anything else. Here we see that the Kamo Shrine is constructed in this particular year, and that would be a pretty significant cultural event. Okay, so let's leave the 10th century behind and move forward to the 1200s. Here we have a change in what positions are noted. So what happens in Japanese history right before this? Well, of course, the Genpei War happens 1180 to 1185. We move out of the Heian period and into the Kamakura period. And once we're into the Kamakura period, then the positions of the ministers at court aren't nearly as important as, for example, the regent, the military regent. Now, that's a rank that we didn't really discuss, but I'm sure you can imagine what a military regent is and does and how important that could be, why we call it the Hojo Regency, for example. So here, what do we get on this chart? We're given who the emperor is. We're given who the retired emperor is, because those retired emperors were now super important. The regent, okay, or the chancellor, depending on who's there. The barbarian subduing commander, or the shogun. I love that translation, the barbarian subduing commander. I'd like to put that on my business card someday. All right, and the next thing is the military regent, which is here the Hojo, somebody from the Hojo family. So these charts are modified depending on what's going on in history and what is important to the time. Now, if we leap even further ahead into the early Tokugawa period, we see that we get the emperor and then we get the shogun. We don't have information anymore about who the chancellor is, who the regent is. And here we're told that the shogun is Tokugawa Ieyasu. And he was shogun from the 12th day of the second month of 1603 to the 16th day of the fourth month of, and they give us the Nengo here, which is 1605. And then we see here that that title changes. Here in 1605, we get a new Tokugawa person in charge with new dates. Okay. One last thing, why is the emperor's name in parentheses here? Because if we flipped back a page, then we'd see that his reign begins on a previous page. So this is sort of a continuation, if you will. Let's go into the 20th century. This is 1944. A lot happens in 1944 and 1945 in Japanese history. Now we're still given who the emperor is, but instead of the shogun, we're given who the prime minister was. Leading into this page, the prime minister is Tojo. We see that name here in parentheses. But then we can see successive prime ministers in that really turbulent period right at the end of World War II. So we see a new person here, a new person here, a new person here, a new person here. One thing that I should note is that at this point, the dates are no longer lunar. These are going to be solar because, of course, the calendar changed in the 1870s. So that should just give you an idea of how the Japanese historians organize at least a nembetsu. And that can be handy. You can go and check out that chart. You can figure out, what was happening at the same time as some other event that you may be researching and that kind of thing. Last but not least, I want to look just briefly at some English language resources and give you a little bit of word of caution. In evaluating whether a source will help you, check out first the index and the bibliography. Don't just start leafing through the main text. Just like evaluating a website, you got to be sure it's worth your time. Figure out if the person who wrote the book knows what he or she was talking about. If the book doesn't have an index or a bibliography, it might be of marginal help, but I say might. Sometimes a useful textbook will not have much of an index, but if it's in English, it probably should have an index and a bibliography. Japanese history textbooks tend not to have very good indices or bibliographies, but I'm just talking about English language resources here. So if it's one of those histories, there's sort of these chatty histories in which history professors narrate that big picture of some country's history. Those tend not to have much in the way of indices or bibliographies. It doesn't mean that it's factually a bad book. Maybe everything in there is true. But if you find something interesting that you need to follow up on and there's no index and there's no bibliography, you're going to have a really hard time doing it. Moreover, the index might be kind of small. It might be very selective, and your topic might not be there. So that can be problematic too. Now, today, we have the advantage that a lot of books are indexed on Google Books. So even if the author didn't produce a very good index, but you think, gee, I still think this book is worth looking at. I wish it had a better index. Check to see if Google Books has it. And see if you can search the text using Google Books. If the bibliography is short, then the author might not have done the appropriate research. It's not necessarily the case, but it's possible, and that would be a bad sign. Most importantly, you should look for original language sources in the bibliography. If the author of your secondary source doesn't read Japanese, then you should put the book down and forget it, at least for the purposes of writing a scholarly paper. Okay. If you're just reading for fun, well, there's no harm in reading for fun. But if you want to base your research paper on this secondary work in whole or in part, then you want that groundwork research that went into the secondary source to be really solid and robust. And the further back you go in Japanese history, as written by Westerners, say, the early 20th century, the late 19th century, the more likely it is that you'll find somebody who was working with sort of a hobbled experience, somebody who didn't have access to all the Japanese language sources that he or she might need. And as we've seen, looking at that canonical list from Webb, there are an awful lot of important canonical works in Japanese history that have not been translated into English. So the author of a secondary source who's not able to look at those texts is partially blind to the material, and that's not a good thing. All right, that is it for the Historical Resources Learning module.